So I'm going to get started. So first off, let me say welcome to everyone. Just so that we're on the same page, this session is the CORSIA session. So we're going to be focusing on the role and impact of aviation on the climate crisis. We're really glad to have you here. And in this session, we're going to have a conversation about the future of CORSIA, updates on recent decisions, and other avenues for climate action within the aviation space. So without further ado, let me quickly introduce our panels for today. We have Ms. Nancy Young, Vice President of Environmental Affairs at Airlines for America, and Ms. Tauni Berger, Director of Strategic Initiatives at Xpansiv Market CBL. Both Tauni and Nancy have impressive and extensive backgrounds and experience with CORSIA and carbon markets, and they'll be sharing some of their insights with us today. So to kick us off, I'd like to invite our panelists to tell us a bit about their experience with climate action in the aviation sector and with CORSIA. So I'll pass it to Nancy first. Nancy, please go ahead and introduce yourself and give us some of the background.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, and I hope you can hear me because it looks like my screen's frozen. So, yeah, okay, you can hear me, good. As Kristen noted, at Airlines for America, which is the major trade association for the US airlines. But I think more critically, we've been involved in the climate space domestically and international for a long time. And really the story about CORSIA for us is that back in, gosh, it goes back farther than this, but in 2009, we worked with the global aviation industry to establish a stepwise approach to significant climate action to build on what already was a drive to be very fuel efficient. And we put together as a global industry, so all of the aviation sector, airlines, airports, air navigation, manufacturers, this stepwise approach to fuel efficiency improvements through 2020. And I think what becomes really significant for the CORSIA discussion is achieving carbon neutral growth starting in 2020, and then working to a really aggressive 2050 goal. And at that time, the global industry committed to a 50% net reduction in CO2 emissions in 2050. Now that part has changed, but it was all focused on, let's keep building our technology. Let's build more fuel efficient aircraft. Let's lightweight those aircraft. Let's have operations. Let's develop, which our industry did, the sustainable aviation fuel industry. Let's make alternative fuel a reality for our jets. And let's really make sure the air traffic infrastructure and airport infrastructure can accommodate us. But even with that, with the projection, we knew that achieving carbon neutral growth in aviation, given the demands placed on shipping and connecting people and the importance of it to the economy, there would need to be a market-based measure. And so that's where CORSIA really comes in. The global community worked together, 193 countries in the International Civil Aviation Organization, a United Nations body with very similar membership to the UNFCCC, to agree on this market-based measure, the first global market-based measure of its kind. Now, just a couple more words in my introduction, which is the thing that CORSIA does for us is it's really this gap filler. And I know we're going to get into that, but it's been more than that. And it is really a first of its kind of program. And I think it's a beacon out there. To let you know also, we'll get into it more. My organization, Airlines for America, recently noted the commitment of all of our members to a net zero carbon emissions goal by 2050. And so we really need the CORSIA system and robust offsets to really help us with that transitional process to the long term. So I'm excited to be here and talk about what's going on in our CORSIA market and the role that it plays despite the COVID impacts. And I really appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion.
Great, thanks Nancy and thanks Kristen. It's a pleasure to be here on this panel. I'm looking forward to the continued discussion. As mentioned, I'm Tauni Berger. I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives at CBL. And we operate the largest environmental commodity spot exchange, trading in renewable energy certificates, carbon offsets, differentiated fuels, and down in Australia, we trade in the water market. As mentioned, we're part of the larger company Xpansiv, which is a registry for digital ESG products. And we are transforming commodity production data into a digital data format, which incorporates an array of information traceable back to the point of origin about the producer's superior environmental practices and embedded ESG standards. And as CBL, part of what we're involved in the aviation industry is we've been working with aviation clients for many, many years, supporting many sectors on their decarbonization journeys. And specifically why we're involved is a number of years ago when ICAO and all of the states were developing the CORSIA program, IATA, the International Air Transport Association, which is the global industry body representing airlines, they had a vision for how to simplify this process of complying with CORSIA for all the airlines. And so they turned to us, CBL, which was already operating an environmental commodity spot exchange, to operationalize their vision and to turn it into a practice that was easily accessible to all of the airlines, as we already had a robust exchange in place with plenty of liquidity and traders across many different industries and markets. So we provide a centralized marketplace for the aviation industry to source not only their CORSIA eligible offsets, but also their voluntary carbon offset commitments towards many of their net zero goals and things like that. And the Aviation Carbon Exchange was launched last January, so perfect timing for 6 weeks later, the industry to go into a bit of free fall with the pandemic. But what I will say is we have actually seen incredible commitment from the airlines and from the aviation industry stakeholders, OEMs, as well as airports, in the support of the Aviation Carbon Exchange and in support of CORSIA ongoing. And so that's not only been incredibly heartening, but and I'm sure that Nancy will speak about this later, but we've actually seen increased commitments towards decarbonization from the industry during this horrible time of the pandemic, above and beyond, even though they have been hit incredibly hard. So looking forward to having a further conversation, and thank you for having me.
Thank you very, very much for that, both. So all those who are listening in, as you can see, Nancy and Tauni have lots of experience with CORSIA, and I'm really, really excited to have them here to share their insights. So I'll get right into the discussion, and I'll start off with a question, both for Nancy and Tauni. And just to give those who are listening in some background, if you've been following CORSIA, you would know that the ICAO Council took a decision recently to change the CORSIA baseline from the average of 2019-2020 sectoral emissions to just 2019 sectoral emissions for the pilot phase of CORSIA, which is from 2021 to 2023. So I would like to ask Nancy and Tauni if they could share with us what this baseline change for the pilot phase means from their perspective. And whoever this, I think Tauni, maybe you, and then we'll continue the conversation.
Sure, I'm happy to start. So we see it as a pragmatic solution. The aviation industry's balance sheets were decimated in the last year, and I think it's been shown that with the inclusion of the 2020 baseline, there would be an additional cost in the billions of dollars for airlines to be able to comply with that baseline. So I think to the degree of it being 30% more stringent as well as pre-pandemic versions. And so, let's remember, this is the first sector-wide global scheme that has been agreed upon for decarbonization within a sector. And I think that that's no small feat and no small win for the entire world. And so if we were to keep the 2020 baseline in with the average, we feel that it would have cost potentially the entire program, that the number of states that had voluntarily participated would potentially exit the program and leave it useless. And so we believe that keeping the program in place and having something in place to guide the airlines is better than no program at all. That also said, we also have to remember that CORSIA is one part, and I think Nancy alluded to this in her introduction. It's just one part of the decarbonization plan. So there is still a big focus, first and foremost, on technical improvements, operational improvements, and the scaling up of sustainable aviation fuels. And CORSIA is still just part of that. And even despite the pandemic, what we've seen is, and what we should actually really be focusing on, is the end of day ambition and meeting the ambition that they've set out for themselves, and not just focusing on the baseline of CORSIA, but really what is the action that is being taken currently towards meeting decarbonization goals, like the net zero by 2050. I think that IATA is saying that they're looking at net zero by 2065. They've been meeting, they've met their 1.5 annual efficiency improvements year after year. And again, a lot of the airlines have made really significant commitments towards decarbonization regardless of the baseline. So I think that the baseline is an important thing to take into consideration, but when we're really looking at the overall ambition of the entire program, that's what we should be focusing on, is the action towards meeting that ambition. I'll pass.
I think that's a really good overview of the situation, and I guess I would underscore a couple of the points. As Tauni said, getting an agreement, a global agreement that addressed the issues of the array of developing, developed, and emerging economies was really quite significant. And a lot of it really had to do with being able to do CORSIA in phases, as you pointed out, Kristen. The pilot phase is the first 3 years, and it's appropriately called the pilot phase, actually, to test some things out. And CORSIA has a built-in review process every 3 years that allows questions like this baseline question to be revisited over time. Being able to bring all these countries together required two things. And Tauni pointed out one part of it, which was that voluntary aspect of it for the first 6 years. When a country signs up for this, it's voluntary for them for the first 6 years, but it becomes mandatory for all of their international aircraft operators. And so the expectations and understanding when they signed up for this were that the emissions actually in 2020 to be averaged with 2019, we're going to actually be higher than 2019. And there were lots of analyses that were done about the cost of this system and what it would mean for the array of countries and their operators, and also the level of emissions ambition that it would bring. And unfortunately, we're meeting that level of ambition in a very unfortunate way with a lot of reduced flying right now. In fact, US Airlines themselves in 2020 permanently retired over 330 aircraft. And that, at the height of the COVID crisis, we were 94% down in flying altogether. And as Tauni mentioned, it was about a 60% international aviation emissions reduction in 2020 relative to 2019 and what was expected. So essentially what we're saying is the ICAO Council, the governing body, made this decision to preserve CORSIA by saying we're going to have the baseline for now be what was projected. And the other part of the exciting part about CORSIA, the way it's structured, there's a formula for how aircraft operators will have to pay to offset emissions. And that starts with a collective approach for the first 9 years. So the baseline there is very important too to equity, making sure that it didn't overly stress certain parts of the world with the way that collective obligation works. So I think it is an accommodation, and I think importantly, there's a built-in review process that will be considered, and we'll go from there.
Great, thank you for those. I think those were really good explanations of what the baseline change means for the industry. I do have a quick follow-up question based on what you both mentioned with regard to ambition and also with regard to post-2023. So given that, Nancy, you mentioned that a lot of the ambition has been met unintentionally by the reduction in flying. Given that, how do you see ambition increasing as we move forward, as we recover from the pandemic, taking all things into consideration, of course, with how the airline industry has been affected? And in terms of what plans maybe airlines might have for implementation of CORSIA post 2023. Because as you mentioned, we do want to keep ramping up ambition in any way that we can. So I'd be happy to hear from you both on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're really proud that despite the financial and other challenges that COVID has posed to the industry, including the U.S. airlines, very, very negatively hit, the climate ambition is there. So what you're seeing is, and remembering that CORSIA itself is really for international aviation emissions to help be that backstop to ensure carbon neutral growth. So it will kick back in as needed if growth, starts coming back and we're not able to, keep that down by sustainable fuel and other things. But also our commitment includes domestic. And a lot of people forget that. CORSIA was designed specifically for the international market and what could be agreed there. But our members have recommitted in our set of updated goals to continuing the carbon neutral growth domestically as well. And I think that plus so many airlines making voluntary commitments, like a few of ours are already agreed to completely offset their domestic flights and continue doing that during 2020, actually. And others have portions of offset programs that are voluntary as well. To continue doing that as a bridge to demonstrate that we are going to continue to cap our emissions growth and we are going to continue to move towards those net zero targets. So again, we're proud of the role that CORSIA plays for the international backstop, but it really is, in our view, kind of a beacon for what you can do domestically, and it sets very high quality standards for what the offset market needs to do in meeting voluntary demand as well as mandatory.
And I would add to that from the market side that airlines, just like everybody else, will be awaiting to find out what the decisions are from ICAO for the next crediting periods and what will be included. And I think that there can be an assumption that the programs and the projects that are included now will extend, but we don't know that for sure. But what I think has already been signaled to the market is that there is high demand for CORSIA eligible units, whether or not they're purchased by the aviation industry. That the fact that there is an ICAO body that has set a robust set of criteria for carbon emissions has become really attractive to a lot of different players in the market. And so what that's doing is that's also bringing really strong finance to the project developers who now have not only the financing, but also the market signal that creating or expanding on existing programs is a worthwhile endeavor. I would also say that we're seeing higher issuances for certain types of projects, but we will still have the problem that demand is going to overshadow supply for a while. So in some ways, this may help provide that there's enough supply, but I think that it's going to be a while before we know exactly what is going to be included for the baseline in 2023 and what airlines will prepare for. I think the entire carbon market ecosystem is awaiting that information to know how to plan. So we'll be looking forward to that next set of instructions.
Thank you. Those are very helpful responses. And I know I want to keep a check on time, but Tauni, just to clarify on the last point you made, that demand will overshadow supply for a while. So you mean with regard to CORSIA and the programs that are approved by the technical advisory body to meet the CORSIA offsetting requirements, there will be greater demand than supply. Just to clarify that point.
For right now, that's what we're seeing. And we're seeing that in the next couple of years that the supply will start catching up. But for right now, the forecast is that demand will be overshadowing supply.
That's really interesting to know. The reason I asked is because I was thinking with the pandemic and everything, it would have shifted. So yeah. But moving right along, just so we can keep on track and on time, my next question is for Tauni, but Nancy may also have insights, so feel free to jump in as you wish, Nancy. So Tauni, can you shed some light on how the carbon market has been preparing to meet CORSIA requirements, like the emissions units criteria, and also any insights on your engagement with airlines to familiarize them with purchasing of units, the EUCs, as well as the technical advisory body process? Anything you can share in that regard would be great.
Sure. So, going back last year, I would say that the entire ecosystem of carbon markets were, waiting at the starting gates to find out what the TAB was going to recommend to the ICAO, and then what ICAO was going to go forth and accept and approve as programs and as project types for CORSIA. And many of those were obviously already in play. They selected programs that already were generating or registering projects across the board. But everyone was waiting to find out which specific criteria, what types of projects were going to be included so that we could go forth with the next steps. So we had already launched the Aviation Carbon Exchange at that point, and as CBL, we are already connected electronically with a number of the registries that are part of that have been approved by ICAO. So that put us in a really good position to come right out of the gates, ready and available to do some of these transactions. And we've been, again, creating the simplified marketplace for aviation so they can come in and see all of the credits that are available in the market, but then also filtered down by what is CORSIA eligible. And so we've been working really closely with the registries to help support that process by tagging specific projects that they know are eligible. And then as far as how we're working with the airlines, again, we're working very closely with IATA in specific outreach, individual outreach to the different airlines, and working with them not only to build capacity and understanding of the broader carbon markets, because a lot of what we're doing is helping them understand the entire landscape of what the markets look like, how projects come into fruition, why they got accepted by the technical advisory board, and how they will come to market. And then helping them further understand how to actually utilize the exchange in order to source and transact those offsets. And then how the interplay with the registries work to ensure that there's no double counting, to make sure that they're compliant towards CORSIA obligations when that time comes, which they don't have to report yet until 2024. So really working closely just right now to build capacity as they get familiar with all of the different obligations that are required of them. The other thing that I would say is last fall, the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets was launched by Mark Carney and others to create a streamlined process and a streamlined taxonomy for the carbon markets to really bolster what already exists in the market and make it more streamlined and more aligned throughout the world. And so there's a core carbon taxonomy, but there was also a recommendation to create standardized projects or standardized products, that would simplify the ability to purchase carbon offsets that had a specific criteria. And so one of the things that CBL also launched to simplify this process, not only for aviation, but in the broader market, is we created the first standardized contract for carbon. We call it the Global Emissions Offset. And it's based all on ICAO criteria. And so the reason for this is it creates a straightforward way to acquire carbon offsets without having to do the heavy lifting of due diligence on each individual project and project type. When somebody comes in, the airlines come in and they say, we don't have the resources to research every project and understand what's what. They can purchase the GEO and know that they're getting an offset that is already benchmarked against ICAO criteria. So it also helps set a transparent price signal to the market on what the cost of a CORSIA eligible carbon offset in the market is at the time. And so we have launched the spot market for that, and then we've partnered with CME to also access that market through the futures market. So we've seen really strong adoption of this above and beyond the voluntary purchases in the market that are CORSIA eligible. The GEO traded, I think, over 1 million tons just in March. So there's really strong adoption, and it's available to all markets. So that's the other thing, is it's not just aviation related, but what we are seeing is that other sectors are looking to the ICAO criteria to set a definition for what is a reliable, valid, trustworthy, and high value carbon offset. So I think that's another thing that's really important about what CORSIA has done for the market, is set a standard and set a criteria that other sectors are looking to as a trustworthy benchmark. The last thing I'll say, and it's slightly separate, but we're also seeing, and ICAO has last fall included a few more RED Plus type of projects. And so we're seeing that more and more organizations are also seeing the value of nature-based solutions in their portfolios and wanting to make sure that they not only invest in energy efficiency and renewable energy type projects, but also in nature-based solutions. So we also recently launched, it's separate from ICAO and CORSIA, but we also launched a nature-based standardized contract. And so it may be that down the road, depending on what ICAO puts forth, that also complies. But what we're basically trying to do is meet the market demand and meet the requirements and the requests of aviation to have an opportunity to also support nature-based projects in their portfolio, even if it's just for voluntary projects. That was a very long-winded answer of how we're working with the aviation sector, but we're trying to provide the centralized marketplace. We're trying to simplify the transactions and overall keep them flowing towards their decarbonization goals.
I mean, if I could just add two things, that was, really some answer. I mean, I just want to underscore the rigor of the emissions units criteria. I mean, we have 11 requirements for the governance bodies themselves, the programs, an additional 8 overlaid specific to the units themselves. And then on top of that, the technical advisory body, a 19-country expert body of really climate experts, agreed for purposes of the current availability for CORSIA, a vintage restriction and a start date restriction as well, which I think is part of what Tauni's saying about further limits that. And we are looking towards the tab expanding that as they are able to do what they're doing with the multiple, different programs that are coming to them to get reviewed. So I think the rigorousness, it does really, it is really significant, because it is really something that is sort of a model out there. And as I said before, I think a number of our members are focusing on CORSIA type credits or CORSIA approved credits for voluntary coverage, even if they don't have a CORSIA obligation. I think that one final point I would make is the type of service that Tauni's group is providing is really important, because what has happened with CORSIA, but even more broadly, the voluntary commitments of the aviation industry, whether it's airlines or actually business aviation, which we haven't talked about, there are a lot of different players with lots of different levels of sophistication. And this commodities market for many of them is relatively new. So being able to have systems that are clear like CORSIA and say, here's what you need to have a good system, and then having mechanisms in the market to make those distinctions, I think is incredibly valuable and will, again, be a model for other sectors as well.
Great, thank you both for those responses. And Tauni, don't worry, it wasn't long-winded. It's exactly the type of information that people are interested in. So I'm really, really glad you gave us that breakdown on how you've been working with airlines. And I think what it means is that once we're coming out of the pandemic and we're able to recover from the pandemic, airlines will be ready to hit the ground running and meet their CORSIA offsetting requirements, provided that, we can fly again. So
our goal, absolutely.
Yeah, so I think it's great. I think you guys are doing really great work with them to help get them prepared for that. So my next question is more directed towards Nancy, but of course, Tony, you can feel free to add your insights as well. So very recently, at the end of March, Airlines for America announced a net zero carbon emissions by 2050 goal. So I just wanted to ask if the airlines have been discussing what the transition might look like to achieve this goal, this 2050 goal. Have there been discussions about when the industry might peak emissions and then come down to, ensure that you meet that goal? And also if there are any plans to address non-CO2 impacts, given that there are statistics out there saying that total aviation climate impacts are 2 to 4 times more than just CO2 alone. So any insights on that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And when you make a commitment like that, a number of our members, had already been focusing on a net zero, and we had been working with them on our 50% goal and then on net zero. You need to kind of know how you're going to get there. So it's a great question, because what we are doing as U.S. Airlines and A4A is in doubling down on that commitment to carbon neutral growth, both domestically and internationally, is, you have to cap your emissions somewhere. And so we've reaffirmed that relative right now to a 2019 baseline. So that is pretty critical to not have growth emissions. But to your point, if we're going to meet a net zero goal, that means we need to get our own emissions reduced as much as possible well before 2050. And the way we're going to do that is this combination of airframe and engine technology, operations, infrastructure, the modernization of the air traffic management system, and sustainable aviation fuel with high quality carbon offsets to bridge that gap. And so that's really critical. Part of what our A4A and our members announced was a key part of this is the sustainable aviation fuel element, which is we have set a goal for achieving 2 billion gallons of cost-effective sustainable aviation fuel supply in 2030, and that is a huge, that's a huge lift, 84% increase year over year from now. Now you say, well, why are you thinking about that when we're talking about CORSIA, carbon offsets? Well, interestingly, CORSIA has done something for the sustainable aviation fuel world as well, because one of the aspects of CORSIA is if an aircraft operator purchases sustainable aviation fuel, meeting rigorous life cycle and sustainability criteria, those can count against their offsetting obligation. Well, what is that doing? That has created a global standard on sustainability and life cycle greenhouse gas emissions that is kind of like the CORSIA itself for offsets, kind of telling us what we should be doing on sustainable aviation fuel. And so we're not going to get there with sustainable aviation fuel alone, but we're going to drive that as far as we can. But because it's going to take a long time to scale that up, because it's going to take a long time for us to be able to electrify aircraft that the type that you would want to fly overseas on, we're working on those research and development programs with governments. But really, to get all those pieces together, it has to be an all of the above approach. So what we're looking at, again, is CORSIA is right now slated to go through 2035. To the extent offsets are needed, we know they're not going to be favored for meeting a net zero goal. But to the extent they're needed, we think it's going to transition much more towards direct carbon capture. And we expect there to be very rigorous requirements akin to what we've got now in CORSIA, but we do expect some evolution over time of what availability of offsets, what are acceptable, and then ultimately, can you count direct carbon capture and sequestration, and what are the rules for that? So more fun to come, I think.
And these are all things that we're looking at down the road as well. As Xpansiv, we're looking down the road at what types of projects will be acceptable in the long term for also not only avoidances but reductions, complete reductions, as well as removals, and trying to create a marketplace as well for digital assets that will meet those. And then also, there are a lot of conversations right now about not only how to scale sustainable aviation fuel, but how there can be a market for digital certificates for fuel in areas where people can't necessarily access the physical fuel. And so that has not been decided. That's not been something that's been included yet in CORSIA or by ICAO, but it's something that the market is a way to help organizations be able to purchase SAF even if they can't physically buy it.
Great, thank you for that. I think it's that the airlines, the members of A4A are thinking about, how they're going to reach this goal. And it's not just a goal that was put out there with no plan in mind. So I'm really glad to hear that. And I'm looking forward to getting more information on the plan as we go forward in terms of meeting that net zero goal. I think I'll move right along to our other question. And this one touches on aviation and NDCs under the Paris Agreement. So I'm happy to get insights from you both on it as you wish. So with this question, we're hearing about countries, for example, the UK, having more and more discussions about including aviation in their national targets under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. So I was wondering what your insights and perspectives are on what this means for CORSIA, given that it is enhanced action. And, we love to see more action. We love to see as much as can be done. But what does it mean for CORSIA? How might it intersect with CORSIA? And that sort of stuff. And in addition to that, I wanted to ask if you have any insights on how we might avoid a patchwork of measures, given that a lot of countries might be considering following in the UK's footsteps and addressing aviation under their national targets. So any insights you have on avoiding that patchwork of measures would be great. At the same time, recognizing that more ambition is always good. So happy to hear your insights on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And we have to maybe start with just a little baselining on that, which is, as I said at the opening, pretty much the same set of countries under the UNFCCC are the same countries under the International Civil Aviation Organization. And folks may remember that the countries decided to handle the international side of climate policy for aviation in ICAO, largely because of this whole issue, like who's responsible for, who owns the emissions, and the separate treaty for international aviation called colloquially the Chicago Convention essentially says countries need to work out the rules for international aviation together so that you would be able to fly from one to the other. Now, you get to this question then. So in the UNFCCC and ICAO, they've sort of been this division that these countries will deal with the international over here, and the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement, NDC, typically is considered domestic. So what did the UK do? They have decided to pull in their own industry, at least that's what they've said. We're pulling in the United Kingdom international aviation industry into our NDC so that we can track it that way. And we're going to impose measures to meet this significant goal that we have, which they just re-upped to 78% reduction in 2035. What does that mean? So at a minimum, it means that the UK is going to, we would believe they will honor CORSIA, because in their UK emissions trading scheme consultations, they said they respect CORSIA, they helped with the negotiations, they believe in CORSIA, but we believe they'll be working with their own aviation industry to say, what more can you do in your international operations beyond CORSIA? And in their consultation, they basically said they want to apply the UK ETS on top of CORSIA in sort of a CORSIA plus approach. The EU itself is looking at a very similar approach with the EU ETS. The issue there, I think, is not that countries cannot choose what to do to their own aircraft operators if they want to treat it sort of in an NDC with their country-specific or region-specific policies, they may do that, but they may not unilaterally apply those types of policies to the aircraft operators from other countries. And I think, Kristen, that's where the interesting part about this is going to be, which is complete respect that whether it's the UK or the United States, or whether it's the EU, they can decide, we're going to do this plus to our aircraft operators to make sure that we're doing what we think we need to do. But if they want to do that to somebody else's aircraft operators, they need to do that bilaterally or multilaterally. And so we have commented in the UK and the EU ETS system that if you're going to do that and try to include US airlines or other airlines, you need to do that multilaterally. We have a tremendous concern about the patchwork quilt that you mentioned, which is part of the reason for the multilateralism is so that you have a system that's known and it can't be imposed or gamed as a trade barrier by another country, at least not unilaterally. You can decide to do it mutually, so there's a level playing field between those countries. One last observation, there is one of the things about CORSIA that's real, two things about CORSIA that are important. One, CORSIA in the first many years, as I said, the first 6 years, is a voluntary between countries that have signed up. And only the flights between those countries are covered by CORSIA during that time. That's the type of bilateral multilateralism that you need where, okay, there's a level playing field on those flights between those countries. So you kind of want to see a mirror of that if there's going to be something like CORSIA Plus. And then the second point is a significant part of getting the CORSIA agreement was that it would be the single market-based measure applied to international aviation without this unilateral overlay. So again, if there's a multilateral agreement, it works. But if it's a unilateral effort to apply a CORSIA Plus or try to assert your NDC on some other airlines from other countries, that would be a no-no as far as the treaty obligations go.
Great, thanks for that, Nancy. And Tony, this question is a follow-up to what I just asked and what Nancy just responded with, but I think you may be better positioned to answer this in terms of what your perspective might be on how the carbon market has been planning to adjust to rules under the Paris Agreement with regard to Article 6, for example. So that's the carbon market under the Paris Agreement. How is the carbon market planning to adjust to those while at the same time having these CORSIA requirements that, as we've mentioned before, set a really good standard for offsets?
Sorry, my mute button was not coming on. The carbon markets, excuse me, I'm frozen. Am I frozen?
Okay, we're able to see and hear you.
Okay.
Fine.
Okay, sorry about that. We're seeing a lot of growth in the carbon markets in general. And again, this comes back a little bit to
I think Tauni might be having a little of the technical difficulty I did. Maybe I could take a first stab and then she could jump back in, which is, for us as airlines, we're really looking forward to the continued and hopefully concluding negotiations under the Paris Agreement on internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, ITMOs, because right now that's part of the limitation of what's happening with the CORSIA rules, which is this question: how are the countries going to agree to account for the transfer of emissions units from domestic to the international world or across borders? Or how are they going to deal with climate finance and joint sort of projects and purchasing in terms of who owns those emissions units and how do you avoid double counting? Now, we know a lot of the principles for all of that have been set out, but you really do need to complete that rule book to be able to go forward with that in a very robust way. And particularly from an airline point of view, we're looking for that to happen so that ICAO's technical advisory body, the TAB, can then say, okay, now we're able to widen the eligibility vintage years, start date, whatever it is, with what the countries want to do in terms of accounting under the Paris Agreement. So at least from what do we look for from an airline perspective, that's it. And I know the market has a lot of other issues with it. And I'm sure Tauni, she may be back now. I froze earlier, so I understand.
Yes, sorry. Thank you for jumping in. I could hear you, just couldn't or anything myself. Anyway, this is also going to be where the registries play a really strong role, because CBL as an exchange, our role is to provide a venue for transactions. And if there are specific programs like CORSIA that have specific regulations, then we will do our best to create a system that makes it simplified for the aviation or maritime or whatever group that starts having a CORSIA type program come into play is available. But the registries will be a really important role in being able to track that accounting and to make sure to ensure against double counting. I know I'm not answering your question. I'm sorry, I got a little flustered, but I'll come back to it in a minute.
No worries. I think that's you got right to where I was you to on the issue of double counting and accounting. How are we going to, or how is the carbon market going to ensure the avoidance of double counting, given that it's a requirement under CORSIA and also under the Paris Agreement? And I do think that the registries and organizations like your own are well placed to be able to tackle this issue. So I think, don't worry, you're very fine. So if you do want to come back in, feel free to let me know. If not, I'll move on. All right. So I think we have about 10 minutes left. So what I want to do is spend about 5 minutes just wrapping up our conversation. And then I think we could take 5 minutes to take a couple questions from the audience, as long as that's okay with the next speakers. So I think we got a lot of good information from you both today, and I really want to thank you for that. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being so frank and sharing your insights on these questions. To me, I think it's clear that there is still a commitment to CORSIA from the airlines, which is really important and good to see, despite everything happening with the pandemic. I do think that ambition is one of the most important questions that we have to keep in the back of our minds as we continue in terms of the implementation of CORSIA, as well as the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And I'm happy to hear from Tauni that a lot of work is being done with airlines to get them ready to meet their CORSIA offsetting requirements once we get back to that stage of having offsetting requirements and we're out of this difficult time that we're in. And I'm really glad to hear that the Airlines for America has committed to that net zero carbon emissions goal for 2050. And like I mentioned, as much information as we could get on that, I think the public would be really happy to see, your plans and what the projected growth for the sector is and how we plan to bring those emissions down in the future. So that, all of that being said, I think I'll pass it back to both my speakers to allow them the chance to give a quick wrap up if there's anything they'd like to highlight in terms of what they're working on or things that are to come in the aviation sector with regard to climate. Please feel free to go ahead and do that in this wrap up, and then we can take a question or two from the audience.
Well, I guess my bottom line would be that we've taken a fair amount of criticism over the governing body of ICAO deciding to have the baseline just be 2019 for CORSIA. But I hope in this discussion today that people have been able to confirm that the aviation industry has continued to commit to and is taking action to address our carbon emissions. But I think more than that, we have a lot of a belief in CORSIA, and we are using the CORSIA criteria even in voluntary action, and very much look forward to it, it will kick in when when we get back to a growth posture, and we will continue, to try to rely on it. And we're pleased that the countries have continued to work on some of the details of ICAO, including this, and triennial periodic review, which will conclude by 2022, and the ICAO Assembly will decide the next steps on CORSIA, even as it decides for those countries to decide on a long-term goal. I mean, we must remember that aviation has these long-term goals, but the countries themselves in the international aviation arena need to also decide on one, and the transition from CORSIA to the 2050 timeframe.
And I'd like to jump in and say that we also really appreciate organizations like yours, Nancy, and IATA that are working to help the airlines to meet these obligations. And then, like Nancy said, what I think that the takeaway really should be is looking at the big ambition of the entire industry and how they are meeting those goals, and looking at CORSIA as a really integral and important piece, but not the only piece of the entire program and the work that the aviation industry is doing. I also think that I'd really like to appreciate also the Technical Advisory Board and the work that they're doing to ensure that all of these different registries and programs and project criteria are meeting really rigorous goals, so that the entire global community can rely on these and look to them as a benchmark for the type of projects that other industries may want to purchase. I think that the whole ecosystem is really strong, and that the big picture is that this is a really strong program, and that aviation is taking incredible strides. And I think that they'll meet it, because everyone that we've been talking to has not only a professional but a personal passion towards decarbonization of this space. And I think that there are some really incredibly smart people working on it, and we're pleased to support the whole program and hope that it's a great success.
Great, thank you both. I think now I'll open up the floor for questions. I know our session manager, Lucy, has been monitoring the Q&A. So Lucy, I can pass it to you now for you to highlight some of the questions from the chat.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Kristen. Is everyone able to see me and hear me okay? Okay, great. Just go for the first one. So it asks, how is CORSIA credit demand outstripping supply right now when ICAO dropped 2020 from pilot phases emissions baseline and international air travel is still a fraction of pre-pandemic levels?
Well, because, going back to what we were talking about earlier, that looking at the criteria, a lot of other industries are looking at that same criteria as their decision-making for what purchases they make. So it's not just the aviation industry that's purchasing CORSIA eligible units, but also these units were eligible for purchase before they were eligible for CORSIA. So it's more that during that time frame, there were only a certain number of projects that were in development, and the time frame for the projects is January 1st, 2016 until the end of 2020, with the exception of some of the ACR projects that got an extension to 2023. But so that significantly limits the supply of offsets in the market if you're not going back further years than that, or not expanding it past the end of 2020. So I hope that answers that question, but there was limited supply to begin with, but then the demand for CORSIA eligible, or at least the ICAO criteria type projects, has been pretty widely adopted within the broader market.
Just to add, I completely agree. Part of it is that overlay of like the start date limitations and other things. They really couldn't give a very long period for CORSIA unit eligibility, again, waiting for some more detail out of the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement process on the international transfer of units. So it's a very limited supply, but also, as I noted, not just other sectors, but the aviation sector, for so many airlines have voluntary commitments, including voluntary programs for carbon offsetting, that they're looking more and more to those units to meet meet those because they know they have the rigor that people expect.
Thank you both. Looks like we have about 5 minutes left, so I will just ask one more question that was submitted in the chat. The question says, regarding the nature-based projects Tauni mentioned that will be eligible to get CORSIA credits, could you expand? Could these include coastal ecosystem conservation or blue carbon projects?
So I think that's a great place for me to clarify what I was saying. So the nature-based offset is not necessarily CORSIA eligible. What I would led into it with, which probably created confusion, was the fact that in the last round of Technical Advisory Board, or the ICAO inclusion, was more inclusion for RED Plus projects within Vera and AFALU projects within Vera, as well as including the Art Trees project. So what it was showing is that CORSIA is looking more towards nature-based projects to support CORSIA, but the nature-based geo that I was suggesting is simply a basket. It's a standardized standardized contract for nature-based programs coming from Vera that are post-2016 and have climate, community, and biodiversity eligibility. But that's separate from CORSIA. The global emissions offset is based on ICAO criteria, and that is eligible for CORSIA. So sorry for any confusion on that, but to answer your question about could these include coastal ecosystem conservation, I would say if it meets the AFALU methodologies of Vera and is post-2016, and has CCBs, then that is something let's talk after this. But it is, as far as inclusion into CORSIA, that would be something that needs to be submitted to the tab.
If I could add, I mean, we absolutely want to see those types of solutions come in, and that is exactly what the tab is about, looking to see if the program governance system can meet the 11 criteria plus the units under it meeting the 8 criteria for approval under CORSIA. And you know, in our view, the airlines in particular, you know, we fly around the world, we connect the world, and we want to be able to invest in communities where we fly. And so a number of the nature-based solutions, whether it's RED Plus or whether it's the broader things like the blue carbon or others, are really ways for us to demonstrate in the places that people go, and the places that we ship goods to and from, and supporting developing economies with that, that we're also putting in climate finance through the qualified offsets. So we welcome that.
Right, great. Thank you both very much. I think we are right on time in terms of wrapping up. So I think that's all from me. Thank you very much to our participants, the audience, for listening. I hope that this was an insightful discussion and interesting as well. And thank you to Lucy, our session manager, and thank you to the speakers for their time. Hope everyone has a good afternoon or evening wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you both.